I've done more with the observed stupidities of my professors than I could have ever done with their knowledge. So, my PhD was really a 2-for-1. An academic degree and a sarcastic theater play. It all seemed like I'd got the best of everything. Yes, I'd learned that universities aren't what they're cracked up to be, but I was none the worse for it. Was I? Was there a cost to all this inept teaching I'd sat through? Well, if there was, what could it be? The answer actually came from Shakespeare. Not the works, the biography. A few years after graduating, I was looking around for a new idea to write. I'd become a monologist, and this would be my third monologue after teaching Shakespeare and teaching Detroit. I remembered a crackpot idea called the Shakespeare Authorship Question. The crackpot theory that Shakespeare did not write his plays and poems. Now, I didn't know much about it other than it existed. Certainly never had a professor mention it other than to laugh at it and say it was a conspiracy theory from the lunatic fringe. That could make a funny play. Create some buffoon character who believes the nonsense that Shakespeare did not write Shakespeare. So I started looking around for information on the subject. I didn't know if I could find it. I didn't even know if anyone still believed it. But once I started looking, I discovered there's actually thousands of books on the subject. Thousands. Oh, that was a surprise. Not one of these books that ever appeared on any professor's reading list. I never so much as opened one. So I did. I opened one. And I read for the very first time, there are no surviving plays, poems, diaries, or even any letters in William Shakespeare of Stratford's own hand. What? I never heard that before. Wait, how can I have a PhD in theater and never have heard this? And why wasn't I told this? You know, there's over 900,000 words in Shakespeare's plays and poems, and every last one of those words in the original handwritten form is lost. Isn't that an interesting piece of trivia? Isn't that something you'd tell a theater student? Like I know lots of theater trivia. For example, the ancient Greek playwright Aeschylus was killed when an eagle dropped a turtle on his bald head. Well, how come I know this fact about Aeschylus and this other fact about Shakespeare? And why wasn't I told this? And what about his letters? No correspondence in William Shakespeare's own hand. Okay, look, I studied Shakespeare. I knew he divided his time between his home and family and business dealings in Stratford and his theater work in London. So I was assumed as a famous author he'd written dozens of letters, maybe hundreds. I was assumed as a famous author everyone would have kept his letters, or someone would have referred to getting a letter from Shakespeare in a diary. Hey, today I got a letter from Shakespeare. But no one could even find that. Years after finishing my theater studies, I learned on my own for the first time there is no actual contemporaneous paper trail connecting William Shakespeare with his works. Why wasn't I told this? But then I learned researchers in Stratford had found Shakespeare's last will and testament. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Shakespeare's will. We're going to find out what happened to all his writings. No. Shakespeare's long and detailed will, it goes on for 3 pages, over 1,300 words, mentions all sorts of things like swords and silver gilt bowls and second-best beds, but never once mentions that Shakespeare was a writer. Never mentions a book, a play, a poem, an unfinished literary work, not a scrap of manuscript of any kind. This is William Shakespeare's will. Now, how exactly did I get a PhD in theater and not hear this? Why wasn't I told this? But then I learned there was an actual text manuscript surviving in William Shakespeare's own hand. Not a play he had written, a play he had helped rewrite. This is the famous Sir Thomas More script, and Hand D, or the fourth hand, is believed to be William Shakespeare. And if so, this is the only text manuscript surviving in William Shakespeare's own hand. And this is where there's a very interesting Canadian connection. This theory that Hand D was written by Shakespeare goes back to the 19th century. Well, in the year 1960, the Stratford Festival, right here in Ontario, Canada, was doing a series of lectures, and they decided to confirm once and for all that this was written by Shakespeare, and they had a very interesting way of doing it. They went to RCMP headquarters in Ottawa, and they asked, "Do you have a handwriting expert?" And they answered, "Do we have a handwriting expert? We have the handwriting expert, Commissioner Roy A. Huber. He wrote the book on it. It's called Handwriting Identification, Facts and Fundamentals. It's still available on Amazon to this day." So they go to this Roy A. Huber and they say, "Look, we have 6 signatures. Can you study this and confirm once and for all that the signatures are written by the same person that wrote this handy? Simple project. Actually, Roy A. Huber didn't know what he was getting into because the writing back then is considerably different, obviously. But he spent 3 months on it. He became an actual expert at reading this type of writing and prepared a whole lecture, did the complete analysis, as only the RCMP can. Goes to Stratford to give his lecture. They're all sitting there, much like today. He starts his lecture, quote, "A positive identification of Shakespeare as handy is not possible." Shock goes through the room. What do you mean? They wanted to confirm the thing, not open a can of worms. But he's got a whole lecture. He's got charts, and he shows them. All of the I's are dotted in the signatures. None of the I's are dotted in this handy. And specific letters are completely different. The K in Shakespeare is a completely different K in all the writing in the handy. And you can do this yourself, actually. Go on Google and download the handy and download the signatures, and you can match them up and see exactly what Roy Huber did. And that was the end of handy. Only it wasn't. A very strange thing happened. Nothing. Nothing. The RCMP's findings were completely ignored. Well, this is Shroud of Turin stuff. Remember the story of the Shroud of Turin? Fascinating story. The Shroud of Turin, as you know, is the actual burial shroud of Jesus Christ. And when Jesus Christ was taken off the cross, he was put in this shroud. And when God resurrected Jesus, it burned an image of Jesus' face right on the shroud. You've all seen this on the internet or on TV. The only problem is that in the 20th century, something called carbon dating was discovered. And in a one-time only deal, the Vatican allowed scientists to cut off a piece of the shroud, divide it in 3, and send it to 3 different labs for carbon dating. All 3 labs came back with the same finding, that the shroud wasn't from Jesus' time at all. The shroud was fabricated in the 14th century, which is not surprising because the first time the Shroud of Turin is even mentioned in history is the 14th century. Well, that was the end of the shroud. Only it wasn't. It was completely ignored by everyone that didn't want to hear the information. And to this day, people line up for hours to see the shroud, even though it's been confirmed by science, it has no connection to Jesus whatsoever. Well, this is the exact same thing that had happened with this handy. That's when I realized why none of these authorship questions were ever taught to me in all the schools and colleges I attended, because Shakespeare's not factual. Shakespeare's not historical. Shakespeare has, in fact, become a religion. And it can't be questioned. Don't take my word for it. Let me quote one of the foremost Shakespearean experts on the planet, Professor James Shapiro of Columbia University, a strict believer in the traditional story of William Shakespeare. Listen to what he says. Quote, "I personally believe that William Shakespeare wrote the plays and poems attributed to him. However, the Shakespeare Authorship Question remains taboo in academic circles and walled off from serious study." Unquote. Taboo and walled off from study. I wasn't aware there are 400-year-old literary questions that are taboo and walled off from study. Then I learned there were these giants in history who dared to question whether Shakespeare was an author. Sigmund Freud, the great Sigmund Freud who founded psychoanalysis, said Shakespeare never was a writer. I didn't know that. Walt Whitman the poet said Shakespeare never was a writer. Henry James, the great 19th century essayist and novelist who wrote Portrait of a Lady, Turn of the Screw, Daisy Miller, a bunch of other books. He said, quote, "I'm haunted by the conviction that the Divine William is the biggest and most successful fraud ever practiced." Unquote. Notice he says Divine William. There's that religious thing. Mark Twain, the Mark Twain, Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer, one of the greatest writers in history, studied Shakespeare's biography, actually traveled to Stratford-upon-Avon to investigate and decided it was all hogwash. All of it. Mark Twain even wrote a book about it. Here's a copy of it. It's called Is Shakespeare Dead? 1909. It mocks the total speculation, which is the lifeblood of all Shakespeare biographies. I'd never heard of this book. No professor had ever mentioned it. It certainly never appeared on a professor's reading list. Then I found out most editors leave Is Shakespeare Dead off Mark Twain's list of books. They don't like what the book says, so the book never happened. In our modern civilized world, we no longer burn books, we just leave them off lists. Now, all of this, which I was learning for the first time, wasn't so much about Shakespeare. Obviously, someone or some group wrote the plays and poems. Thank God we have them. This was about education, or rather, miseducation. I had a right to this information and to do with it whatever I chose, and yet it had been kept from me. And all I'd received from all of the professors and all the schools was orthodoxy. Yes, orthodoxy, from the Greek orthos meaning true and doxa meaning belief. Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. It's not factual, it's a belief. Perhaps it's true. Perhaps it's true. But the only way to find out is to examine the evidence. And this had never happened. Why? Why was Shakespeare this untouchable god who must never be examined? Particularly when all these giants in history, like Mark Twain and Sigmund Freud, who said there was a question. There are times in a man's life when he becomes so angry, so furious, so murderously enraged, there's only one thing that person can do, and that's write and perform a one-man show. This was one of those times. Play I was going to write about the buffoon who believes Shakespeare did not write Shakespeare, that didn't happen. Instead, I adapted Mark Twain's Is Shakespeare Dead and debuted it at the 2002 Montreal Fringe Festival. And that's how I became a Shakespeare crackpot.